What if I told you that every country on Earth is drowning in debt? The United States, in debt. China, is in debt. The European Union, is in debt. Even the richest oil kingdoms and emerging superpowers, also in debt. But here's the question no one seems to ask. If every country owes money, then who is the creditor? Who is the world actually indebted to? Because basic logic says debt must go somewhere. It must accumulate in someone's pocket, someone's balance sheet, someone's hands. So where is it? Who holds it? And why does the world's financial system function like a casino, where the house always wins? But the house is invisible? Today's story will expose the silent creditor behind the global debt machine. A creditor that doesn't look like a person, a company, a country, or even an institution. Not at first glance. But by the end of this video, you'll understand the answer to one of the greatest financial paradoxes of our age. Setting the stage, background debt is not a modern concept. It's older than money itself. Ancient Mesopotamians carved debt records into clay tablets. Egyptian pharaohs taxed farmers and demanded grain tributes. Romans enforced debt bondage that could turn citizens into temporary slaves. Debt has always been a tool of power. But something changed in the early 20th century, the moment when debt stopped being a weapon of individual rulers and became the central operating system of the entire global economy. And the person who unintentionally set this system in motion wasn't a banker. It wasn't a king. It wasn't a Wall Street titan. It was a man named John Maynard Keynes, a brilliant economist who believed nations could borrow their way out of recessions. His ideas transformed governments from cautious spenders into heavy borrowers. And after World War II, the world designed a new financial order around debt, the Bretton Woods system. The IMF and the World Bank, countries would borrow money to rebuild. Then they would borrow money to grow. Then they would borrow money to survive economic shocks. But absolutely no one imagined that in 2025, the entire planet would owe a combined $315 trillion in debt. That's more than 3 times the world's total economic output. Yet here we are, every country in debt, and still, it's no clear creditor, at least not one we can see. But to find the real answer, we must travel back to the origins of modern sovereign debt. When debt stopped being about money for thousands of years, debt was simple. You lent something, you expected it back. But in the 1700s, something revolutionary happened. Governments discovered a magic trick. Instead of borrowing gold from wealthy families or banks, they realized that they could borrow against the future. They invented the government bond. A piece of paper, a promise, backed by future taxes. It was brilliant. It allowed countries to wage wars they couldn't afford, fund empires that were already collapsing, and spend money they didn't have. Britain used this system to defeat Napoleon. The US used it to finance the Civil War. Japan used it to industrialize. The message was clear. Debt wasn't temporary. Debt was fuel. Debt was power. But here's the twist. Once governments realized they could borrow infinitely as long as they convinced the world their debt was safe, they stopped caring about paying it back. That's right. Modern countries don't pay off debt. They roll it, refinance it, expand it. Debt became perpetual, like a subscription service that nations can never cancel. And with perpetual debt came a new question. If no one ever gets fully repaid, who is the actual creditor? Who's lending to a system designed never to settle? To answer that, we look at how debt exploded in the next phase. How debt became the global lifeblood between 1945 and 1971. The world believed that money had strict limits. Currencies were tied to gold. Debt expansion was restrained. Then came Nixon's shock in 1971, when the U.S. ended the gold standard. From that moment, money no longer represented real value. It represented government promises. The change unleashed the age of unlimited debt. Banks could lend more. Governments could spend more. Corporations could borrow at scale. And soon nations weren't borrowing from each other. They were borrowing from a system that could create money out of thin air. But here's where the story gets even stranger. The creditors weren't just banks. They weren't just investors. They weren't just pension funds. A new super entity emerged, the global financial market. A place where trillion-dollar institutions, algorithms, hedge funds, central banks, shadow banks, and even ordinary people's savings all merged into one gigantic web of money flows. And this web became the true lender to nations, not a single institution, not a single country, not a single billionaire, but a collective creature, a system created by millions of participants and billions of transactions across hundreds of financial instruments. The creditor wasn't a who. The creditor was a what? A global pool of capital with no face and no flag. I mean, this pool grew so large that by the early 2000s, it decided the fate of governments. It rewarded some with low interest rates. It punished others with crushing borrowing costs, toppled economies like Greece and Argentina with nothing more than investor sentiment. The global creditor had risen, and its power was unlike anything the world had seen. The breaking point? When debt turned, predatory debt works, till it doesn't. And the global system reached breaking points multiple times. 1970s oil crisis countries borrowed massively to afford skyrocketing energy prices. 1980s Latin American debt crisis Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina nearly collapsed under interest payments. 1997 Asian financial crisis. Currencies crashed when debt-fueled growth met speculative capital flows. 2008 global financial crisis. A debt bubble in U.S. housing triggered worldwide collapse. 2022-2024 pandemic and hyper-borrowing era governments printed trillions to keep economies alive. Each crisis exposed the same truth. Debt doesn't just enable growth, it creates vulnerability. And every time nations struggled, the invisible creditor tightened its grip. Interest rates rose, currencies fell, governments lost autonomy, public assets were privatized, social programs were cut. Policies were dictated not by voters but by financiers. This is the dark side of global debt. When countries can't pay, the creditor doesn't seize land or gold, it seizes control, and that control reshapes societies. Fallout. The world after the debt explosion. Today's world is built on three fragile pillars. 1. Governments rely on debt to function. Tax revenue is no longer enough. 2. Central banks manipulate debt through interest rates. Their decisions affect everything from mortgages to food prices. 3. The global economy assumes debt can grow forever. But basic math says it can't. Because here's the terrifying part. Global debt is growing faster than global income, faster than population, faster than productivity. In fact, for every $1 of economic growth, the world now creates $3, $5 of new debt. Which means debt is not being used to create value, it's being used to prevent collapse. Debt has become life support. And life support is not a sign of health. Failed fixes. Why no one can escape the debt trap every decade. Economists propose solutions. We should reduce spending. We should raise taxes. We should inflate the debt away. We should default. But none of these work without triggering economic catastrophe. Why? Because the system is too integrated. If one major country defaults, banks collapse, pensions evaporate, global trade freezes. If governments cut spending, unemployment skyrockets. If taxes rise too fast, businesses leave. If we stop borrowing, the entire system stalls. Debt isn't a flaw of the system. What debt is the system? And that brings us back to the question, if every country is in debt, who is the real creditor? The reveal who the creditor actually is. The creditor is not a king, not a country, not a billionaire, not a secret elite. The real creditor is the global financial system itself, a decentralized network of pension funds, insurance companies, sovereign wealth funds, central banks, investment firms, hedge funds, bond traders, everyday citizens investing through retirement accounts, and even governments lending to one another. All participating in an endless cycle where money flows in circles, lending creates more lending, and debt expands with no final destination. In other words, we are all the creditor, and we are all the debtor. Nations owe money not to a single entity, but to a self-reinforcing machine that we all contribute to, knowingly or unknowingly. The global economy is one giant balance sheet, where every asset is someone else's liability. Your savings account, someone's debt. Your pension fund is government bonds, also debt. Your stock investments, backed by corporate debt. Your currency, issued by a government. In debt, the system is circular. It has no beginning and no end. That's the paradox. Modern parallels and shocking data. Let's zoom out and look at the world today. U.S. debt. $35 trillion. China. Debt. Over 300% of GDP. Japan. Highest debt ratio in human history. Europe. Drowning in interest payments. Developing countries. 60 plus on the brink of default. But here's the real shock. Over 60% of global debt is held by institutions that depend on that same debt to function. If governments stopped borrowing tomorrow, pensions would collapse, banks would fail, and millions would lose their life savings. Debt isn't just a burden, it's the foundation of wealth. Debt fuels interest, income, stock markets, real estate bubbles, government programs, military spending, corporate expansion, social stability. The world is addicted to debt. Because debt is the oxygen of the financial system. And like any addiction, withdrawal can be deadly. History shows a repeating pattern. Debt rises. Economy grows artificially. Warning signs appear. Leaders ignore them. Crisis hits. Debt resets through inflation or collapse. The cycle starts again. Empires from Rome to Britain to the US all follow the same script. Debt builds. Debt breaks. Debt resets. 3 takeaways. 1. There is no single global creditor. The world owes money to a decentralized financial system made up of ordinary people, institutions, and governments, all lending to one another in a massive web. 2. Debt is not temporary, it's structural. Modern economies require ongoing borrowing just to function day to day. 3. The global economy is far more fragile than it appears. Debt has become so large that even small shocks can trigger worldwide instability. A warning: the system works, till it suddenly doesn't. History shows that debt-based economies collapse slowly, then all at once. When the next reset comes, whether through inflation, default, or crisis, the world will learn a painful truth. Debt doesn't disappear, it just transfers. So when someone always pays the price. If you found this breakdown eye-opening and want more deep dive stories about the hidden mechanics that shape our world, our wealth, and our future, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next episode. Because the next chapter of this series might just explain how the global debt cycle ends and who rises from the ashes when it does.